This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on successful conclusion and key decisions at G20 Summit 2023. The participants are Ashok Kant, former diplomat, and Mukesh Kaushik, journalist.
We just witnessed the 2 days mega event of G20 where world leaders descended in New Delhi to discuss various issues confronting the nations, especially the economic issues. In those 2 days, maximum issues were such that we cannot sum up these issues in certain minutes. And much has happened, which is notable, which is historic. And I would start by saying this, that a historic declaration of G20 was adopted first day itself, with all 83 paras having 100% consensus, including geopolitical paragraphs which were centered around US-Russia-Ukraine war. It was really a huge satisfaction for the host country. Also, we saw the inclusion of African Union as member of this grouping of G20. We also saw the announcement on the periphery of the G20, the new corridor which is coming up between India, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and many European countries. Mr. Kant, how do you see G20 itself, the 2 day summit which we witnessed?
As you mentioned, summit took place in New Delhi on 9th and 10th of September, concluded yesterday. By all standards, it was the most successful summit. While making an assessment of the summit and India's presidency of G20, we have to bear in mind the fact that world today is passing through an extremely challenging situation. Arriving at consensus, agreement, understandings has become so much more difficult. As you know, global economy is emerging from the pandemic. We have the ongoing Ukraine conflict. There is a growing North-South divide. There is polarization between East and West with strategic rivalry between the US-led West and China. And there is this feeling in the global South that their interests are being ignored. It was against this backdrop that we had to try and find a consensus among G20 countries. And we did that with a great degree of success. Situation, in fact, in New Delhi was much more complicated compared to the Bali summit in November last year. So our challenge had become even more difficult. In terms of outcome, first let's try and understand why we could bring about unanimity, 100% consensus, as you mentioned. I think it was because we centered interests of Global South in deliberations of G20. And this was one issue on which everyone agreed. And we could bridge North-South divide, East-West divide, and play a truly unique role. And we got full support from Indonesia, which was the past president of G20, and the next president, Brazil, and South Africa, which will become president later. So these emerging market economies, including India, along with Japan, which is president of G7 at present, help craft a consensus and build coalitions. So as you mentioned, the leaders' declaration was agreed upon day one itself, contrary to earlier doubts and apprehensions. And the most difficult issue, as you rightly pointed out, was the war in Ukraine. Here, the formulation agreed upon in Bali last year was not acceptable to China and Russia, because the earlier formulation referred to very explicit condemnation of Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we had to find a new formulation through creative diplomacy, which we managed to do. So what we did, we recalled UN Security Council and UNGA resolutions without going into specifics, because those specifics deplored Russian action. We highlighted the principle of not seeking acquisition of territory through military means against territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of any state. And we also stressed the importance of dealing with human suffering caused by the war in Ukraine and called for resumption of Black Sea grain initiative. So it was a good package which was acceptable to everyone. This emphasized the principles rather than an explicit reference or condemnation of Russia. It involved USA, European Union, and G7 countries showing great deal of flexibility, but Russia and China were also cooperative.
We saw that even Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov also welcomed declaration saying that it was our victory.
So that's the good thing, that everyone regarded it as their victory. I think that's a very good example of creative and deft diplomacy.
This was because G20 was happening in New Delhi, and New Delhi has an stature.
Yes, India, because of our relations with various countries, we could act as a bridge across divides. So we were in a way uniquely positioned. And of course, we got support of other countries as well. That's why we could arrive at this consensus.
I was talking to one of the officers involved with the negotiations yesterday, and he narrated how 200 hours of non-stop negotiations took place in 300 different bilateral meetings to arrive at the consensus on this geopolitical scene in the region. Do you think that it was a mammoth discussion taking place?
That's true. That it required really painstaking, patient, and very difficult diplomacy. And we could achieve success where a lot of people were doubting that there will be a leader's declaration at all. And it's not just a declaration, it's a very substantive document which has come out. One very important outcome is bringing AU on board as a member country of G20.
G20 was a grouping of 80% GDP. Now it has also become grouping of 80% population of the world.
Exactly. I think that's very important that, this lack of balance that composition of G20 has been addressed. So it's a very major outcome. A third set of outcomes I will mention without going to details, that on a whole lot of issues, interests and concerns of the global south were addressed. For instance, climate finance. There is a very robust formulation on need for additional finance. Though on the issue of phasing down of fossil fuel, no consensus could be reached. Likewise, strong formulation of restructuring of debt of developing countries, though China could have done more in terms of commitments there. Likewise, we have announced Global Biofuel Alliance, which is going to be very major initiative. India alone, every year we have agriculture waste of 500 million tons, which can be converted into biofuel. So it's going to be a major initiative. Likewise, a whole lot of other areas, including restructuring of multilateral development banks, need to provide them more resources, increase our representation in developing countries. Understanding has been reached, though details need to be fleshed out. Also, on the issue of crypto assets, there is understanding that they'll be regulated. So clearly, we are moving away from earlier position that crypto assets should be banned. Outside, on the margins of G20 summit, a very major initiative was launch of India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. This is going to be a maritime cum rail link from India to Arabian Peninsula to Europe. It's not just physical transportation of goods. It will also include power grid connectivity, green hydrogen pipeline, and digital connectivity. If implemented speedily and properly, it will be a real game changer. But a whole lot of other issues need to be addressed, including, finance, environmental requirements, and we'll have to learn from mistakes made by China in its Belt and Road Initiative.
Do you think, Ambassador, that it is a nice counter or a fitting response to this BRI?
I would not like to look at this as a counter to BRI. It's more ambitious than BRI, and most importantly, it's based on stakeholder consultation. BRI is a China-centric project, and BRI has led to all kinds of problems, including developing countries falling into debt trap. So all that will hopefully be avoided when we implement India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. So on the whole, let me conclude by making two last points. One, that as Prime Minister had promised, we have utilized our presidency to articulate the voice of Global South, but a whole lot of implementation needs to be done. That's why Prime Minister yesterday suggested that there should be virtual summit of G20 countries in late November before we hand over presidency to Brazil. And one last feature, which is again, very important, we devised a very different template for our presidency of G20. Instead of making it a New Delhi-centric exercise, we took it to different parts of the country. As you know, 220 meetings were organized in 60 cities and towns of the country. So it became really, people-oriented exercise. I hope and believe that this will be a new template that will be followed by future presidents of G20. But, a whole lot of understandings, initiatives are still aspirational in character. They need to be fleshed out. They need to be implemented. So the work continues, and work will continue through our participation because G20 has a troika system. So when Brazil takes over presidency towards the end of this year, we will remain as a member of Troika along with Brazil and next chair, that is South Africa.
Ambassador, would you like to throw some light on other issues which were more important economically, like climate finance, which was a very tricky issue?
Yeah, climate finance, India as well as many other countries have made very ambitious commitments under what is called NDCs, nationally determined commitments. We are doing quite well. We are moving towards fulfilling commitments we made in Paris in 2015 and subsequently in Glasgow. But several developing countries are finding it difficult to implement those commitments. So in Leaders' Declaration issued at New Delhi Summit, there is reference to an amount of $5.8 to $5.9 trillion, not billion, $trillion being mobilized to help developing countries fulfill their NDCs on climate change. Likewise, our need to raise $4 trillion for transition to clean energy. These are big numbers. How we are going to do is going to be a challenge. So far, developed countries have not been able to fulfill their commitment to provide funding of $100 billion every year. This they had to start doing in 2020. Now they're saying that this will be done 2023. Let's see how they succeed. But that is not enough. I think we need to mobilize so much additional resources to see that objectives which have been reflected in the Paris Agreement of 2015 are met. And this is really an existential issue. This is not an issue on which we can afford to be lax. And India on its part has taken very onerous responsibilities without sacrificing its interests as a developing country, because we need to move ahead with our developmental agenda. So our role...
Before we conclude, Ambassador, can we also have a little bit of idea from your experience, the outcome of bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden?
Prime Minister had a large number of bilateral meetings, and these are very substantive meetings. You referred in particular to meeting our Prime Minister had with President Joe Biden of the USA. This meeting took place on 8th evening over dinner, and it carried forward dialogue which two leaders had in June this year when Prime Minister paid a state visit to the USA. And at that time, a number of very important understandings were reached. So they have been further taken forward. We have a strategic partnership with the USA, which is multidimensional character and which is being fleshed out in different areas with bipartisan support on both sides, both in the USA and India. Some of the important deliverables are, USA providing support to India in development of jet engine. So GE will be working with Hindustan Aeronautics Limited to develop jet engine. USA has never done this kind of cooperative project with any other country. So it's first of its kind. It's very important.
Ambassador, you would agree with me that India has taken to a new height this G20. From event to outcome, it was huge, unprecedented event. Thank you so much for giving your insight, Ambassador Ashok Khan.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on successful conclusion and key decisions at G20 Summit 2023. The participants were Ashok Kant, former diplomat, and Mukesh Kaushik, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsttalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 928 909 4044.
Akashvani